$3,000 credit card balance, minimum payments only, decades to pay it off. That is not a typo. That is not a worst-case scenario. The U.S. Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has documented how minimum payment schedules can stretch repayment timelines to 30 years or more on balances that most people consider modest, at interest rates that are now close to the national average. $3,000, 3 decades. And the companies who designed that system? They knew. They always knew. Before we get into how this works, there is one specific moment in history, a quiet regulatory decision made in the 1980s that changed everything. It removed a protection that had kept this trap from closing, and almost nobody talked about it when it happened. By the time people started to notice, trillions of dollars in consumer debt had already accumulated. We will come back to that moment, because once you understand what was removed and why, the minimum payment line on your statement will never look the same again. Let's start with the mechanics. Credit card interest is not calculated annually the way most people instinctively imagine it. It is calculated daily. Your annual percentage rate, your APR, is divided by 365. Every single day, a small slice of interest is added to your balance. If your APR is 24%, and according to Federal Reserve consumer credit data, average credit card interest rates have climbed above 20% in recent years, making 24% a realistic figure for many cardholders. Your daily rate is roughly 0.066%. That sounds microscopic. It is not. On a $5,000 balance, that daily rate generates approximately $3.30 in new interest. Every day, before you spend another cent, before you miss a payment, just by existing, that balance is growing. And here is the trap inside the trap. The minimum payment is designed to be just large enough to avoid a late fee and just small enough to never actually reduce the principal in any meaningful way. For most major issuers, the minimum payment formula is roughly 1% of your balance, plus that month's interest charges. Run the numbers. On a $5,000 balance at 24% APR, running the standard minimum payment formula, roughly 1% of the balance plus that month's interest charges produces a minimum payment in the range of $115 to $120. Of that amount, roughly $100 goes directly to interest charges, leaving only about $15 to $20 applied to the actual principal. You have paid over $100. You have meaningfully reduced your debt by almost nothing. $16. And this is the part nobody talks about. That formula was not always standard. It was engineered. In the earlier decades of the credit card industry, minimum payment requirements were meaningfully higher than they are today. Industry research and Federal Reserve analyses have noted that minimum payment formulas have been revised downward over time, extending repayment timelines and increasing total interest paid by cardholders. That was enough to make meaningful progress. Cardholders were paying down debt at a pace that actually threatened to end their relationship with the lender. So the formula changed, slowly, quietly. Over time, issuers progressively reduced minimum payment requirements. Federal Reserve research has documented that the minimum payment formulas used by major issuers today, typically structured as 1% of the outstanding balance, plus that month's interest charges, result in dramatically slower debt repayment than earlier industry standards. No congressional vote, no public debate, just a recalculation inside a product design meeting. That detail changes everything, because this was not negligence. Federal Reserve research published in the early 2000s identified what economists called the anchoring effect of minimum payments. When cardholders see a minimum payment figure printed on a statement, a significant portion of them, even those who could afford to pay more, treat that number as a target. The minimum does not just set a floor, it psychologically reframes the entire debt. Paying the minimum feels like compliance, it feels responsible. The balance growing in the background feels abstract, distant, manageable. It is none of those things. A study published in the Journal of Marketing Research found that when minimum payment amounts were displayed on statements, a measurable portion of consumers paid less toward their balance than comparable consumers who were not shown that figure. The presence of the minimum payment number appeared to suppress voluntary repayment. The number itself suppressed repayment. Credit card companies have had access to decades of behavioral research. They know what that number does to the human brain. They print it anyway. Nobody accidents their way into trillions of dollars in profit. The total revolving consumer debt in the United States, tracked monthly by the Federal Reserve, has exceeded $1 trillion for years and has climbed well above that threshold in recent data releases, reflecting the scale at which American households carry ongoing credit card balances. A significant portion of that balance is carried by people making minimum payments, people who believe they are managing their debt, when in reality, the debt is managing them. So here is the one thing you can do today, not someday. Today, open your most recent credit card statement. Find the disclosure box, federal law requires it to be there, that shows how long payoff takes at the minimum payment versus a fixed monthly amount. That number is printed right on your bill. Then calculate what happens if you double your minimum payment. Even on a modest balance, doubling the minimum payment can dramatically compress repayment timelines. Federal Reserve and CFPB analyses consistently show that small increases above the minimum payment can reduce total repayment time by years or even decades, and cut total interest paid by thousands of dollars. The math works in both directions. Remember that quiet regulatory decision I mentioned at the start? The protection that was quietly removed in the 1980s? That was the strict usury cap. Individual states once had hard limits on how much interest a lender could charge. In 1978, the Supreme Court ruled in Marquette National Bank v. First of Omaha Service Corp. That a national bank could export its home state's interest rate laws to any customer in any state. South Dakota and Delaware immediately eliminated their usury caps to attract bank charters. Within a decade, credit card interest rates across the country were effectively uncapped. The trap was open, and it has been open ever since. So here is the question worth sitting with. If the minimum payment is psychologically designed to anchor your behavior, and the interest rate structure was legally engineered to be uncapped, and the repayment timeline is documented right there on your statement in small print, most people never read. At what point does financial literacy stop being a personal responsibility and start being something that was deliberately made difficult to acquire? This video is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute financial, legal, or investment advice. Always do your own research before making any financial decisions.